In 400 meters, slight right onto North 55 Indus Highway. Slight right onto North 55 Indus Highway. Continue on North 55 for 26 kilometers.
40 years ago, the same man you see before you. That was that. Am I thanked? No. It's the man. A man who faces into society. But no matter what you're doing, for I know the signs of the Lord. I am free from sin. I am always cleansed. No. Hell no. You ain't a man.
You're the Texas man guy. We'd be insane if you let you out.
I would kill you myself, you sick son of a bitch.
The answer is no.
Nobody's bound to fix you. Sure, he the guy in prison last week. What do you do?
You made a whole guy, man. All that was left was just empty clothes in his hair. That's like a magic trick.
This is a decision of whether or not you get the chair, and you do. You absolutely do. The truth is easy, is that did I eat those people? Yes, I did. Did I enjoy it? Eventually. Would I do it again? Point me.
Sharp right onto North 55 Indus Highway. In 400 meters, turn right.
Set me free or not, or whether I stay in here. Either way, I'm going to eat something.
Head south on North 55 Indus Highway, then turn right.
It's been made. You're never gonna
Continue for 1 kilometer.
Honestly, feel no remorse for what you've done. Of course I do. Not a day.
Head south on North 55 Indus Highway.
Because I'm in here.
Head south on North 55 Indus Highway.
Stupid. Try to come. Grab by the shoulder. Grab by the neck. Are you saying you want to
Head south on North 55 Indus Highway.
Yes, it is. I suppose you're right. I'll be on my way.
No, that's the worst thing I've ever heard.
Well, before you answer, let me just say one thing. We already answered. No, dude. Now, whether I walk out of this prison a free man or not.
No, you're not walking out.
At this point, you should only be thinking about what you want for your last meal. A man. For my last meal, one man, please.
No,
2 boys.
no.
Okay, fine. 1 boy. Fine.
सीपक ही रोड जा रही है बहन मेहरबानी
In 500 meters, take the ramp to Hakla Di Khan Motorway, Islamabad, Dera Ismail Khan Motorway. Head south toward North 55, Indus Highway. Head south toward North 55, Indus Highway. Head south toward North 55, Indus Highway. In 600 meters, make a U-turn.
examines the battle of ideas beneath the Communist Party's orderly facade.
Welcome to China, officially communist, yet seemingly driven by highly capitalist values. Officially a one-party state, where public argument is often crushed. And yet there's said to be a policy debate playing out inside China right now, between two opposing schools of thought.
There is a massive battle of ideas about what kind of economic model China should have, what's the political system it needs. And that's fought out not between political parties, but between intellectuals in different places, and think tanks and universities, who sometimes act as proxies for different camps and factions within the Chinese system.
Mark Leonard of the European Council on Foreign Relations has repeatedly made the same journey east that I'm now making. I'm Mukul Devachand, and in this week's analysis, I'm on the road in China, meeting intellectuals from the labyrinthine world of Chinese think tanks.
Literally thousands of academics and think tankers will be involved in working on different bits of the country's 5-year plan. And there are real ideological disputes. You know, if you look at the battles last year between Chongqing and the Guangdong models, they did stand for two completely different worldviews.
Guangdong is the wealthy, industrialized province next to Hong Kong, and for many it symbolizes China's new right, driven by faith in free markets. And deep inland is Chongqing City, a power base for what's been called the New Left, those who want to return to a stronger communist state. Over the last year, the notion that two worldviews are locked in a hidden battle, each with an intellectual stronghold in a different part of the country, has gained traction. I'm here to find and flesh out these schools of thought and work out how they are changing China. So John, in front of us is a really long wall facing Tiananmen Square. What is this?
This is Zhongnanhai, so this is the old imperial centre where the eunuchs and some of the princes used to live, and now it's home to China's top leaders.
I'm being shown around China's capital by John Garneau, a veteran Beijing correspondent from Australia, who's now writing a book about the Communist Party elite. And their ideas and personalities are under intense scrutiny this year. The Communist Party is about to choose a 5th generation of top leaders, easily as significant an event globally as the United States presidential elections. The names of the new Prime Minister and President are already known, but there's much jockeying for seats on the powerful Politburo.
They're trying to decide on who are the next 25, 24 leaders who are going to form the elite leadership body of China in October. Most of them are scheduled to change, and those changes will cascade all the way through the system, in the military, through every tier of government. They'll be changing leaders, and that's all being decided now behind these walls.
Is it about personalities or is it about ideas?
At the most fundamental level, it's a battle of ideas. It's a battle about what direction should China be going. Should it be heading in a more statist, socialist direction, or should it be headed in a more liberal, democratic direction?
Socialist statist versus market liberals, or as some label it, left versus right. Of course, in strict one-party China, these camps of ideas are not distinct, like, say, Labour and the Tories. You won't even hear them mentioned in state newspapers. In person, thinkers and officials alike emphasise consensus. But these two broad intellectual currents are not only now associated with different regions of the country. Analysts say that there are two charismatic senior communist figures who stand out from the mass of grey officialdom as standard bearers for the left and right camps. And both are men you might have heard of recently.
The left is Bo Xilai. This is the guy that's under huge pressure. He's just been sacked from all his official positions. Sounds like there's a chance he's going to go to jail. So he's been purged, but he really was the symbol, the leader of this revival of socialist values, leftist values. And on the right, his ideological adversary is a guy called Wen Jiabao, the premier. And all along, he's been a sole voice, especially in the last few years, for democracy, for justice, for dignity. He speaks a kind of language that none of his colleagues do. All of this sort of exploded to the surface really just recently.
Bo Xilai, from a famous party family, was rumoured to be angling for a national level position. But when British businessman Neil Haywood was found dead in his hotel room and Mr. Bo's wife was accused of the murder, he was suspended, and it became a major global story. I was sent to cover it, but it was obvious to me that Mr. Bo's downfall was more than just a scandal. He'd been in charge of the inland city of Chongqing, which has seen a very open revival of leftist political rhetoric. That kind of thing doesn't happen much in China. Mr. Bo openly styled himself as a champion of the poor, addressing their grievances with China's development. Growing social frustration is visible in hit online videos like this. "Oh China, slow down," it says. "Hold your people's hands." The song lambasts corruption, farmers' land being seized for new shopping malls, poverty at home while China's leaders spend the nation's money in Africa. A far cry from the version of China as a society growing rich that we've been hearing about since the Beijing Olympics in 2008. It's time to meet the first of our Chinese thinkers. He's a liberal in the classical or free market mold, who teaches political science at Peking University.
I am Zhang Jian. I am more liberal than the national average in the sense that I would love to see the country to become more similar in its general political system, more similar to that of, say, UK or United States.
All eyes on the Bird's Nest Stadium, live from Beijing.
Olympic 2008 celebration of the enormous achievement of China in the past 30 years, and that's partly true.
The National Stadium is affectionately known as the Bird's Nest, and we're preparing for what promises to be a truly spectacular opening ceremony.
But immediately after the end of the Beijing Olympics came the Lehman Brothers, bankruptcy.
Financial crash.
The most severe, economic crisis since the Great Depression in 1920s and 30s, right? And I think the continued economic growth and the social stability of China began to disappear at that time. You see a very much reduced foreign appetite for the cheap goods that produced by our labor. And you see more and more problems. I think in the last 4 years we see more large-scale riots in this country than the past 30 years.
I've seen this wave of riots up close. Last year I made a Radio 4 documentary in a southern Chinese factory city where migrant workers trashed homes and burned cars in 3 days of rioting over pay and discrimination. Last week, migrants there rioted again, adding to the 30,000 mass incidents of discontent each year. Zhang Jian points out that even some of the wealthy are getting nervous, with evidence millionaires are migrating abroad.
If both the, if you will, downtrodden people and those most benefited from the past 30 years are having enormous problems with the status quo, then there must be something very, very bad, very, very wrong, I would say. And I think with all those things turned sour for continued growth, continued social stability, then we see a re-emergence of public debate.
So a debate about ideas.
About ideas, about public policy, where the country is.
Educated in the West, often studied economics in places like Chicago, Oxford University. They came of age in the 1980s, a time when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the United States, and they became firm believers in the power of the market, the potential of competition, and they were suspicious of the role of the state. They were in favour of privatisation, and they thought that the way to help everyone in society was through trickle-down economics, so they were very suspicious of the state playing any role in delivering social public services or redistributing wealth. As a group, they were enormously influential.
This group argued that the communist state should shrink. They equate privatisation with freedom.
You can call it very much similar to Washington consensus, give more freedom to the market. Now the problem is that people are not getting their fair share that the market will give them because of our state.
Professor Zhang Zhen is younger than most of China's liberal right, in his late 30s, but in other ways he's typical, a lover of BBC podcasts in English who spent 6 years studying in New York City. Even as a teenager, he was collecting the books of the free market thinker Friedrich Hayek, who railed against state planning in the economy.
The government produced the problem.
The state rather than being a solution to the problem.
Yeah, that's, paraphrase President Reagan.
The liberal solution, then as now, is to shrink the state. And of course that's a very big undertaking in communist China, where until recently every urban resident was registered with a working unit that provided housing, welfare and a job. This so-called iron rice bowl system provided cradle-to-grave socialism. But from the 1980s, reforms began, and state-owned enterprises were privatized at a rapid pace. Professor Zhang would like reforms to now reach beyond economics into the political sphere too. He's also a fan of Karl Popper, the professor of philosophy at the London School of Economics, who advocated an open society where ideas compete. In politics, like in economics, he thinks the overbearing state is China's problem.
You do not have any leverage of the civil society against the government. Do you have the votes? Can you kick somebody out of his office or her office because he's not doing a good job? You don't have it. How could we believe that as a government are going to take care of the people?
So you think more power and tools need to be given to the people?
To the people.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, they have more say in the public affairs.
More say in public affairs?
Yeah, they have more, say, power to, to fire their officials.
Calling for public participation is still sensitive talk in China. One party dominates. But back in the 80s, things were different. Back then, both the West and Chinese reformists spoke about the notion of peaceful evolution. If China could open the economy first, allow trade to flourish Western style, then Western style democracy would follow. And on that reading, were it not for one momentous political event, the liberals, or the new right, might by now have steered China into a very different future. Except everything changed on June the 4th, 1989, as the tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. Students, demonstrating after a liberal reformist official died, did not expect the party's violent response to their mass protest. Hundreds died.
I was a junior at that time in the college, and there's a big debate within the Chinese intellectual community about whether we should pursue our academic research or we should engage more in a public philosophy debate. And I would say majority of the intellectuals saying, yes, we should keep a distance between us and the public affairs. At that time, I think many people believe that as long as the economic reform are going to continue, then gradually this country will become more liberalized, if not democratized.
Professor Zhang Zhen. After 1989, many intellectuals fled China. Those new right thinkers left behind knew better than to push democracy. They concentrated instead on economic liberalization, and the party listened. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping famously designated Guangdong, the southern province next to Hong Kong, as a testing ground for massive free market reforms. China's economy started to boom, starting in Guangdong's special economic zones, and then spreading around the country. But Mark Leonard of the European Council on Foreign Relations says despite this, people eventually turned against the thinkers of the new right.
The phrase which some of my friends in China use is the idea of the dictatorship of the economists. Those on the right made this accommodation with the one-party state and helped to accelerate the pace of economic reforms, but the politics became more and more repressive. They are now, as a group, rather unpopular and resented in society because the consequence of their policies, as well as unbelievable levels of growth for a whole generation, has been soaring inequality.
By the late 1990s, economic expansion had brought its own new social problems. For all the fast food chains and malls in China's cities, privatization of state industries market. In the West, Chinese students witnessed the anti-globalization movement begin to take off and realized that even in Britain or the US, not everyone supported capitalism. China watcher Mark Leonard says a second camp of ideas was beginning to emerge. A new Chinese left.
The new left was called the new left because on the one hand they were rejecting the unreconstructed left that rejected market reforms, and on the other hand they were rejecting the new right's concern with economic growth at the expense of inequality and of environmental sustainability.
China's new left didn't want to end the money coming in from free markets or reinstate the old communist system of work units. After all, they weren't old left. But unlike the right, they wanted a stronger state providing welfare. I became aware of them as a BBC journalist based abroad because their writings online offered a rare window onto social issues which the business press overlooked. Rural poverty, for example. Professor Yang Fan is an economist often associated with the New Left and sums up their view of modern China.
We have passed the best economic moment this country had. The gap between the rich and the poor is skyrocketing. Capitalism has helped us. It pushed us over a certain level of development. But marketization has created bubbles, like food prices, which hurt people. And the markets in China have been corrupt because powerful interest groups have teamed up with the market to enrich themselves.
The New Left didn't all focus on economics. Many were fans of the Palestinian-American historian Edward Said, who railed against Orientalism, Eastern history written in the image of Western colonizers. Canadian professor Daniel Bell at Tsinghua University has lived in China for many years and is friendly with the New Left, both intellectually and personally. He says that at their core, they reject the idea that modern China needs to imitate the West. And although many of the New Left were themselves at Tiananmen Square in 1989, they now argue it was wrong to want Western-style democracy.
Many on the New Left think that the student protesters were not necessarily on the right side in terms of what they were advocating. Now that so many Chinese students go abroad, they have a better sense of the disadvantages of American-style capitalism and democracy, and it's highly unlikely that you would have the sort of demonstrations now that you had then, where it's kind of that the Statue of Liberty it would be the symbol for what China should strive for.
For a new generation of Chinese intellectuals, Western market liberalism and democracy has been discredited. The notion of an enlightened Western foreign policy took a severe beating in Chinese eyes after the Iraq invasion. And our financial crunch and our need to borrow billions from China has undermined Anglo-Saxon capitalism's appeal. So a new wave of superstar thinkers, like political scientist Professor Pan Wei of Peking University, are searching for a Chinese alternative.
The idea that human history is moving towards one direction is a predetermined end. That's what I don't believe. I think each country has its own way of conducting politics.
Chinese politics, he argues, has to achieve something very different from what modern Western democracies do. With a vast area and continent-sized population bringing the constant threat of chaos, the communist system's brute strength may be what has kept the Chinese nation together and developed it enough to stage world expos and Olympics.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the national anthem of the People's Republic of China.
Intellectuals like Pan Wei, for example, are very, very skeptical about the usefulness of democracy and also the consequences which it would unleash, and they worry that China itself would collapse. They're halted by what happened to the Soviet Union.
Professor Pan is not so much New Left as neo-communist or neo-com. He says the party state, just like the old imperial dynasties, rests on four very Chinese pillars of good government.
Four pillars. One is the idea that the government should serve the people's welfare, all the people's welfare. The second pillar is a way to pick officials. And the third one is a politically unified governing body, a party. And the last one in China is a checks and balances through division of labor. So those four pillars have existed in China for more than 2,000 years. It's a Chinese system.
The party, Communist Party, is a continuation
of the history.
In this vast country, schools of policy are in effect allowed to experiment in specific cities. Just as the economists of the New Right were allowed to create their free trade areas in Guangdong near Hong Kong in the 1990s, the party seems to have let another major city become a testing ground for the policy ideas of the New Left. That city is Chongqing, a boomtown in western China. It's been called the Chongqing Experiment, under the leadership of Bo Xilai, the charismatic Chongqing party boss who's just been sacked. These are the sounds of morning exercise drills outside Chongqing's Great Hall of the People. Amongst these crowds, I got a real insight into how this left-wing experiment has gone. An elderly lady tells me the ordinary people thrive during Bo Xilai's rule. Chongqing invited in private factories, creating jobs, but it also created welfare schemes that help people like her, including social housing and pensions for workers. This man says Chairman Mao's revolutionary China was a more equal society, and Bo Xilai was a modern-day Chairman Mao. One enthusiastic lady sang me a Mao-era Red song, something Bo Xilai's government encouraged. The poor admired how Chongqing's government chased down corrupt, wealthy businessmen. But I met people who'd been tortured during these campaigns, brutal even by repressive Chinese standards. Bo Xilai's reign here ended when his wife was accused of ordering the killing of British businessman Neil Heywood, highlighting a potentially dark side to the Chongqing experiment. John Garno.
In fact, it was completely brutal. There were murders and people being tortured all over the place in Chongqing. But yes, he stood for something, what looked like a plausible model for China's future. He started an extraordinary campaign against mafia activity in Chongqing and did two things. It showed that A, everything was not well in China, but there was real mafia on the streets of a major Chinese city. And two, he was the one that was taking a stand against it. He had the guts to challenge these problems with the system. At the same time, he started publicly hailing back to the times of Mao Zedong, sending text messages praising Mao Zedong, getting people to sing old revolutionary songs. In fact, it was very complicated and contradictory inside, and he wrapped himself in this Maoist iconography, really.
Chongqing's Maoist iconography is deeply shocking to China's elite, because although Chairman Mao is still officially venerated, his rule is also remembered for its brutal and divisive social experiments. Thousands banished to the countryside, the bourgeoisie violently suppressed. Now that the Chongqing experiment is effectively over, all the mainstream New Left academics I spoke to for this program disown Bo Xilai's violence and his invocation of the Chairman Mao years. And it appears that as a result of all this, China's liberals are back. Journalist John Garno again.
One of the things it did was it prompted or it provoked a very strong backlash. All the long-suffering liberal intelligentsia, the lawyers, the journalists who'd opted out in 1989, they all came out of the woodwork to rebut, to argue against what Bo Xilai was doing in Chongqing. And just in the last year, we've seen this great cleavage opening up between, in the most simple terms, Bo Xilai's socialist, neo-Maoist Chongqing model and what they call the Guangdong model, which is like the southern part of China, which has always been a bit more liberal than the rest. And those two camps have sort of begun to starkly stand up against each other. And those tensions exploded at the National People's Congress in March this year when Bo Xilai was sacked.
So although officially Bo Xilai was removed over the murder of a British man, it's now being interpreted as a strike back against the leftists by a resurgent liberal wing or new right in the Communist Party. This past year, their free market heartland, Guangdong near Hong Kong, has added some political and social reforms to its long-standing economic ones, tolerating strikes, press freedom and village-level elections, for example. So could this be good news for China's liberals? Is the party preparing for a flowering of political reform when it changes leadership? It's impossible to say, because in Beijing, the mood right now is far from liberal. Even for this program, people were reluctant to talk.
Okay, so my local colleague here has just been in touch with a guy who I wanted to meet. He won't meet me. He's one of the many web monsters in China who represent the New Left. I was very much hoping to meet him. But because of recent political events, there's a kind of a chill wind blowing around people like him.
I don't see any significant sign of doing political reform.
Professor Zhang Zhen does not think the Liberals have the upper hand. And he's worth listening to because, of course, he himself is on the Liberal New Right. The outgoing Premier, Wen Jiabao, is seen as a leading Liberal reformer. But after the autumn, he will have to step down as the fifth generation of leaders take over. And in fact, the years of his rule have seen pro-market reforms stall and pro-democracy activists and artists suppressed.
I mean, Wen Jiabao has been saying that for 3 or 4 years, and you don't see any tiny bit of real political reform.
Well, Wen Jiabao is perceived as the reformer.
By many, not all. Well, he didn't do any reform up to now, right? And next year he's going to be out of the political stage.
In the West, we've often failed to grasp that modern-day China does now have competition between ideas and social models. Both New Left and New Right offer homegrown solutions to the anxieties gripping this rising power. But in the wake of the Bo Xilai affair, the biggest question is not which of these camps or which mix of policies China's fifth generation of leaders will choose, but whether they'll allow this open battle of ideas to continue.
You've been listening to Analysis, presented by Mukul Devachand and produced by Lucy Proctor. The editor of Analysis is Innes Bowen. Analysis explores the ideas that shape the world, and you can download more, including our entire archive of briefings on economics, social trends and politics from iTunes or on the BBC website.
Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/radio4. I hope you enjoy the program. Hello. In 1789, the Bastille was stormed, King Louis XVI was put under National Guard, and the calendar was turned back to zero. The French Revolution began its upheavals in the name of liberty, equality and fraternity. On this side of the English Channel, there were those who thought bliss it was that dawn to be alive, but the statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke wasn't among them. He said, "The age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever." Was it really the end of an age? What was the impact of this revolution on the culture of Europe? And did it really change political life in Britain forever? With me to discuss what kind of a watershed the French Revolution marked in the tide of history, especially in this country, is Stefan Collini, Professor of Intellectual History and English Literature at Cambridge University. He's currently working on a book on the intellectuals in Britain and France. And Janowitz, Professor of Romantic Poetry at Queen Mary College London, who wrote Lyric and Labour in the Romantic tradition. And the 19th century historian Andrew Roberts, who's currently working on a book on Napoleon and Wellington. And Janowitz, can you set the scene for us about British revolutionary culture, say, in around the 1780s, 10-15 years before the French Revolution? What links were there, to start with, between the British and French, as it were, would-be revolutionaries?
Well, I think it's very important to realize that there was a domestic radical movement in England that begins centuries before the idea of Anglo-Saxon freedoms and the notion of a free-born Englishman. That continues and develops in the 18th century, and that becomes quite important around a series of radical campaigns in the second half of the 18th century, including the campaign for enfranchisement, the campaign for dissenters' rights in Parliament for civic entitlement, campaigns developed from cranky people coming from the countryside for land nationalization, the abolition movement. We're talking about space now. Can you give us some idea of the time? We're talking about 1770s, We're talking about the 1770s and 1780s. So when we think about...
And land nationalization, something as radical as that.
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about the impact of the French Revolution on English culture, we tend to have a thought of Wordsworth wandering around in the countryside musing on how heavenly it had been to be young in the period of the French Revolution. But in fact, to really think about the impact of the French Revolution on English political, cultural, and literary activity, I think you really have to turn to the city, to the social, urban experience, where the impact was really felt, it seems to me, as a catalyst for things that were already going on.
So towards the end of the 18th century, let's say, just for roughness, of the last third, the period of the Enlightenment, there's a lot of, as it were, revolutionary thought around in England, particularly in the cities, especially in London, and that corresponds with, in fact, there are corresponding societies with France. Yeah.
In fact, one of the most extraordinary things about, the impact of the idea of what was happening from the storming of the Bastille was that it brought together persons from all different walks of life and social backgrounds into groups, which is what happens in cities. People go to taverns, they talk to each other, they go to dinner parties, they talk to each other, and societies were formed, which were called the corresponding societies, which were set up as really as radical pen pals between London and Paris, where people wrote to each other. In fact, the genre of what was called the friendly letter became a very political genre in the period. So in the corresponding society in London, you had radical intellectuals, you had people like Spence, the land reformer, you had dissenters all talking to one another, which I think was an extremely socially, culturally radical activity.
Well, that gives us some idea of the bedding in before the revolution itself. Stephen Collini, weeks after the storming of the Bastille, the Whig leader Charles James Fox wrote to a friend, quote, "How much the greatest event it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best." That's a very powerful statement, obviously. Why did he welcome it in such exultant and radical terms?
I think there was a strong sense in Europe, outside France as a whole, that this really was one of the most dramatic and significant breaks in history. After all, France was in some ways the most powerful state and strongest monarchy in the 18th century in Europe, and the idea that it might be challenged by this kind of popular movement, although in 1789, it's worth saying, it's not yet a very broadly popular movement, it's on the whole still quite an aristocratic movement, and the traditional elites who gather in Paris for these meetings are not really in any sense what we would recognize as leaders of a democratic movement. But nonetheless, they are challenging the autocracy, they are challenging the inherited privilege of the strongest state in the world. And I think it's worth saying that with somebody like Fox, he's drawing on a liberal British tradition which had prided itself on its constitutional monarchy. And so in some ways, where Britain had been taken as the model for advanced political and constitutional arrangements in the 18th century, particularly by French admirers actually, there was now the sense that this was going to be taken further, and that this was an optimistic development, which of course, as I'm sure we'll discuss, then comes to grief in some ways.
But if you take Fox as the man who really welcomes it, and the man on the other side quite quickly afterwards, in response to the Solar Black Rise, Edmund Burke, with his reflections on the French Revolution, points out very sternly what he sees, and he prophesies directly, will be the terrible things that will happen as a consequence of this revolution, and how harmful it is to Britain, to thought, and to Europe.
Yes. Well, I think Burke, writing in 1790 and reflecting on the very first stages of the French Revolution, does foresee, largely correctly, that what's being released here is in some ways a kind of uncontrollable force and forceful violence. Burke argues that politics is inherently a matter of pragmatic, small adjustments to changing circumstances, and that the attempt to begin, as it were, from scratch and to, by the light of pure reason, build up your constitution and to build up your social arrangements and to scrap all the inherited and accumulated diverse forms of social control and
forms of social association that had existed, but this is going to be fatal. This is going to remove the protections that individuals have found in what famously called the little platoons of family and neighbourhood and trade association and so on, and leave the individual exposed to the very chill wind of a central and authoritarian state. And so Burke in part sees this as the defect, really, of attempting to apply rational principles to politics at all.
Andrew Roberts, Burke seems keen to persuade the British people that the French Revolution is nothing like the glorious revolution that happened in Britain and England 100 years before. First of all, do you think he was right? And how persuasive were his arguments at the time? We'll talk about how they lasted later. How persuasive were they to the people he was addressing at that time?
Well, I think that they were very persuasive because the Whig Revolution of 1688 was bloodless. And even on the first day of the French Revolution, the guards of the Bastille were massacred. And so you had a sense that this was going to be a bloody, violent thing in France, whereas in 1688, the revolution that brought the Whigs to power, of course Burke was originally a Whig, were very, very different. He did, however, correctly see that there were much closer parallels with the 1649 revolution. Obviously at the time of writing the reflections, he didn't know that the king would be decapitated as obviously Charles I had been. But the parallels there were an awful lot closer, and he was able to spot those because he had the advantages of the system.
Do you think he was thought to? Do you think that his arguments proved right? That's a big word at the time. His predictions, sir,
were very quickly.
But how? Sorry, what I really want to. How did his arguments? How big a grip did they have on the British, particularly the power, those who ran power at the time? And was that because of the arguments, or was that because it was from our old enemy France, and we were turning against them, that sort of thing?
Well, I think the predictions are important to take into account because as they slowly unfurled and actually came one after the other to be seen to be true, so the argument was strengthened. The arguments that he was making, that we just heard earlier about the nature of civil society, man as a fallen being, politics of envy, if you like. These things were strengthened massively as time went on, and it had a tremendous influence on conservative thought, on the Hittite reaction that did, of course, become Prime Minister 5 years before the revolution took place. But he was just yet another politician of the day until the revolution. And then the backlash, the Tory backlash, as it were, really dominated British politics until the fall of Liverpool in 1827.
Can I just move to this review, Jonas? Can I just move to the third person in the sort of the receiving of the French Revolution? We had Fox, greatest event. Burke, watch out, this is going to lead to terror in Europe. And then we have Thomas Paine. Burke lost the House of Commons debate on the French Revolution to Fox, and then Paine wrote Burke as he rose like a rocket, he fell like a stick. Why do you think that Paine won the argument, and how did he win the argument?
Well, I do think that the notion that Burke was proved right, and somehow that means his impact was most important when he said what he says, is not actually what happened culturally in England at the period. You had Fox, who became very close to dissenting movement for reform, and these more cranky street-level radicals, who in fact, certainly up until the end of 1792, did in fact imagine, as Wordsworth said, that we were forerunners in a glorious course, and that in fact what was happening in France was like the Glorious Revolution. And what was quite extraordinary, I think, about Paine's response to Burke was that Paine said, if you look at what happened in 1688, what you have to understand is that what it established was that it should be principles and not individual persons who are the bearers of the state. He said it should be reason and not custom that determines how we govern and how we understand legislation. And for that reason, it should be the present and not the past that determines how we understand how we want to make our lives politically and culturally. And this had an enormous resonance amongst persons who were not only interested in a democratic franchise, but who, having been shaped by and illuminated by the Enlightenment, felt that these were all rational principles, that in fact, if it were in fact the case that the Revolution of 1688 embodied these, then the French, what looked like it was going to be a constitutional monarchy, would be the spreading of that. I think it's important to note that when we talk about the impact of the French Revolution on English culture, that there's an enormous impact of English culture on the idea of the French Revolution.
Can you briefly reply to that, Andrew? I don't want to take it forward.
Just very briefly, yes. I agree with that. The fact is that it held back things like franchise reform for 40 years. The reaction, the Hittite reaction, was able to just wipe the French, but nevertheless, this was obviously now going to be a war to the bitter end. Because she was the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, and whilst it was considered understandable if the French killed their own royal family, to kill Austrians as well was absolutely madness and evil and vicious, and this is what really made the Napoleonic Wars so long-term and vicious.
Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to say that it seems to me that what's quite important to realize is that the guillotine of the King and Queen meant in England that the idea of the Glorious Revolution as the antecedent was exploded, let's say, and the English regicide is what appeared as the ghost from the past, which I think that was what precipitated the reactionary legislation that Pitt then put through. And it's quite interesting that, nothing really happened in England. Nothing really happened in terms of large-scale riots, but what happened was speech, seditious writings. The legislation against seditious writing was about the fear of what talking about freedoms might mean. And if people recalled the regicide and the period when there had been a commonwealth in England, that was what seemed very dangerous to the state in England.
Can Napoleon be seen as a continuation of the French Revolution and his impact as part of the French Revolution?
Well, of course, this has been the long-running debate, really, about how far there is some kind of inherent logic to the initial French revolutionary principles, which leads to what becomes eventually a Napoleonic autocracy. I think the first thing to say is that, of course, the traditional British historiography about Napoleon had been that that's the enemy, and he's bent on conquering Europe, and we, in the name of British liberties and so on, are resisting him. Of course, in most parts of Europe, it wasn't seen like that. Napoleon came as the liberator. Napoleon and the French armies were bearers of revolutionary principles, often attracting support from the indigenous radical movements in the various European countries, and aimed at the overthrow of the monarchy or the established order there. But I think what very quickly comes to be argued is that the very way in which the later stages of the French Revolution had concentrated all power in the state, had eliminated the intermediate bodies, paved the way, if that state fell into the hands of a figure like Napoleon, for an almost limitless tyranny. And much of the argument throughout the 19th century then precisely was this the result of a series of contingent circumstances, the fact that the French did go to war, as we've already said, which changes the nature of their politics? Was it to do with the response of the monarchies of Europe? Was it to do with the sheer chance of Napoleon's own ambitions and talents? Or was he, in this sense, the kind of logical embodiment of the state power, centralized state power, which the revolution unleashed? I would just quickly say, of course, the in a way more subtle revisionist account of this that we get in the 19th century, especially from somebody like Tocqueville, is that the French state had always been a centralized autocracy. That actually Napoleon wasn't very different from, for example, Louis XIV and Louis XV in the 17th and 18th century, and that in that way, and in a way this is the provocative element in this revisionist account, in that way
what we're dealing with here is a continuity in French history and not the establishment and export of universal radical principles.
Isn't it also the case that the other idea of Napoleon that makes him different from the king is that he's just a guy. He isn't born to privilege. He brings himself up, and so again, in relation to its impact over in England, there's a sense of Napoleon as somehow being the continuation, perhaps, of a democratic or a revolutionary idea.
But did his arrival after an ideological revolution bring to war and politics in Europe? Let's concentrate on that for a start. The idea of ideological conflict. The idea of war on a different scale, levied en masse, instead of there being armies of 60 or 70,000, these armies were 600,000 strong. Everybody's in the army. The nations of war, the idea of nations. I mean, did he actually push it on in a way which would not have occurred, Stefan, I don't think, to the Louis?
No, the Bourbons were never going to invade Russia. It's a peculiarly Napoleonic concept that nationalism could be used for him, and of course later in Germany and Italy, and particularly in Prussia, it's used against him. In the War of Liberation of 1813, the Prussians think of themselves as Germans really for the first time, and that they're going to wreak a terrible vengeance on France.
He's responsible for German nationalism.
He is, absolutely. Militarism, Prussian militarism. He's responsible, in a way, the French Revolution is responsible for the two terrible things that have happened in the 20th century, communism and German militarism.
Stefan, are you lost for words or are you finding the right one?
Somewhere in between those two. I think we have to stand back a little from just the immediate events of 1789 to 1815, because there we're concentrating on what Napoleon did and the effect that he had. But I think, taking a slightly longer perspective, the idea that members of a modern state are citizens, that this in some sense is a matter of their political equality, that...
talking about men, yeah.
Well, that of course is part of the argument thereafter. That was argued during the French Revolution itself. I mean, there were a set of traditional liberties in Britain guaranteed by the law for certain categories of people under certain headings. But what I think the French Revolution exported, and in a way still symbolises, is the recognition of the dignity of the citizen as such, not simply by the chance of living under certain circumstances or having acquired certain status in that society, but that members of that society, as you rightly say, for much of
in 500 meters, merge onto service road.
The principle, of course, has then been exploited quite properly to be extended. But the role really of a modern politics is in some way to give recognition to this dignity and to treat people as equal bearers of rights. I think that is why the revolution remains such an enormous point of reference for modern history, and in a way it's a much more optimistic account of it, for all that happened in the 20 years immediately following 1789, a much more optimistic account of its significance than this rather pessimistic
Continue on Islamabad-Peshawar Motorway for 5 kilometers.
Not just all turns tyranny, but also so quickly Napoleon he infuriated many of the Romantics. When he crowned himself emperor, he went back on the religious agreements that the revolution had spawned. He created an aristocracy. He made his marshals princes and dukes, and in one case a king, and really rebuilt so much of what the revolution was all about ripping down. So when you look at the, as you rightly say, Stefan, the enormous political implications of the French Revolution, you really have to go back to 1789 and very little further than that, because it's the principles of 89 that don't really last for more than about 3 or 4 years, that are in the hearts of people, especially in America. We haven't touched on it, but that's crucial, especially with Tom Paine. But
can you touch on America and Tom Paine?
Okay. Well, Tom Paine's thought was probably,
because he is England, America, and France, isn't it?
Precisely, goes to all of those countries, and is, in terms of the long-term implications of Paine's
in
thought,
3 kilometers, take the exit toward Islamabad Motorway's linked road, Srinagar Highway.
On the creators of the American democracy than anywhere else.
And Jakovic, do you think that the English distrust, British distrust now, of intellectuals in English stems from the fact that the intellectuals are so heavily implicated in the French Revolution?
Well, I think what you're raising is the question of what the meaning of rationalism was, within English intellectual life in that period. Because it does seem to me that, in fact, what Wordsworth argues when he describes his experience of the French Revolution retrospectively is that he mistakenly was a rationalist when in fact his heart was a sympathetic, intuitive person. And so his history of the French Revolution becomes his discovery of how he had split himself in half and had behaved as a rationalist in accordance with the principles of the French Revolution, whereas really what he was at heart, in a sense, was like a Burkean, that is, interested in custom, interested in rootedness in the land, interested in native affection. And that has meant that the history of cultural life, which sees in Wordsworth and his inheritors the sense of how it is not the rational but the feeling that allows us to understand each other and relate to each other, was actually codified, I think, in the Prelude. It's why that poem becomes so important in English history. And yes, I certainly think that rationality and our distrust, well, your guys' distrust of rationality, does come from a concerted sense that that reason is overtaking what we know intuitively, which is really the Burke's ideas of knowing things sort of through the body and the land. And
I think I think that's right. I think the British are right to be distrustful of intellectuals. One thinks of the damage that Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot and the philosophes and the encyclopedists unleashed during that terrible period. And thankfully we didn't have, I mean, the world would be a better place had the French Revolution not happened. And we did have a form of evolution, political evolution, taking place in Britain at the time, which was derailed and sent down a cul-de-sac by the French Revolution.
You know, you say that the world would be much better if the French Revolution never happened, but of course it might have meant that you were languishing in the Bastille at the moment, subject to arbitrary arrest. Surely we've got to recognise that whatever actually, as it were, went wrong in the short term, the world was transformed in the direction of a kind of democracy and a kind of liberal principles, which I'd like to think, even you don't think we should live without.
As Chu Enlai said, it's too early to say.
Right, thank you all very much. Thanks, Stefan Collini. Thanks, Andrew Roberts. Thanks, Anna Witz. And we'll be talking about the Sonnet next week. Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
ये डी खान सीपेक मोटरवे से हैं, उसके कितने? जी थैंक यू।
In 400 meters, take the exit toward Islamabad Motorway's linked road, Srinagar Highway. Take the exit toward Islamabad Motorway's link road. Continue for 11 kilometers.
Get out of the street. Get out of the street.